Season 11 is about to come to a close in about a month, and a lot has happened this year within the game. You've seen no shortage of videos both on my channel and many others expressing frustration with the terrible ranked environment that's only getting worse and worse. But there have been some positive changes to the game this season as well. Positive, at least in my opinion. For one, the complete item system overhaul has been probably the best major preseason change, better than the elemental drakes or class-wide reworks between seasons 5 and 7. Of course, like any drastic gameplay alteration, there's bound to be some growing pains as we iron out all the janks, and we'll most likely need another year before every item is in a healthy spot. During this time, a lot of mythic items have stood out for being way too overpowered, creating mini metas over 2021. If I remember correctly, way back at the start, Eclipse was the most overpowered mythic in the game, then it became Imperial Mandate, then Sunfire Aegis, then I believe it was Moonstone Renewer, then Stridebreaker, one of the more notable ones for sure. Then there was also a time where every ADC was running Gale Force, and then the nasty Turbo Chem tank meta with Udyr and Hecarim, and I'm pretty sure after that we had Shirelia's Battle Song, then Divine Sunderer, so basically most of the mythic items were tier 0 for a moment or longer. Like I said, it will take a bit more time I think before we're at a comfortable spot for every item, but the current one that has me the most concerned is Goredrinker. If you haven't already guessed from the very obvious thumbnail, Goredrinker was also one of the super overtuned items during preseason because you saw Olaf or Aatrox heal all the way back to full with a single press of a button. It got nerfed to give much less healing, but then had that nerf partially backpedaled after Riot realizing nerfing both the items and the champions is what causes the likes of Hecarim to go from 54% win rate to 46%. Sometimes there is such a thing as over-nerfing a champion. I know, crazy concept. I actually did make a video discussing my concerns over Moonstone Renewer being a potential Ardent Sensor Meta 2.0, but this was before my channel started getting big, so I doubt many of you even know about it. Fortunately, that didn't amount to anything since Riot is much quicker on the draw when it comes to shutting down overpowered champions or metas than back then. This will be sort of the same concern video, but for Goredrinker. If you've been playing League of Legends recently this season, you can probably attest to the statement that this is one of, if not the most frequently used mythic item in the game. It was originally meant to be used on fighters like Juggernauts and Divers as a way for them to sustain themselves while in teamfights. Makes sense given that they soak up the most damage and are usually face tanking the enemy backline. When it first came out, along with every other mythic item, that's exactly the purpose it fulfilled. The champions who expected it to be on were fighters and skirmishers like Aatrox, Olaf, Fiora, and Riven. Were they obnoxiously overpowered with them? 100%, that item was pretty dang busted. But then again, so was every other healing based item. Riot had to perform a system-wide nerf on any item that gave healing or omnivamp such as Eclipse, Immortal Shield Bow, Riftmaker, etc. So it wasn't endemic to just Goredrinker, everyone was sustaining way too much, especially if they had Ravenous Hunter or Legend Bloodline. That said, even at its peak, Goredrinker didn't receive that much attention because it was overshadowed by Stridebreaker, which effectively removed the one weakness fighters had, their lack of gap closers and mobility. Darius, Renekton, Garen, Sett, Warwick, it was a fun time. But then of course midway through season 11, Stridebreaker was nerfed to no longer give a dash, and a lot of its users went to either Divine Sunderer or Goredrinker. Fast forward to today, Goredrinker insidiously crept up in popularity. Skirmishers like Xin Zhao, Irelia, and Tryndamere have been fielding this item, even though you would expect them to go for attack speed or maybe Triforce. We've also been seeing this on assassins like Kha'Zix, Talon, and Blue Kayn. It's gotten to the point where even champions outside of Goredrinker's intended audience have been taking this item. Pretty much, if you're a melee attack damage champion, you've picked this item up once or twice. So why is everyone all of a sudden using Goredrinker, and more importantly, how did this even happen to begin with? To answer both of them, we first have to look at the item's properties and the significance of its presence in the game. Goredrinker is a very straightforward bruiser item. It gives 45 attack damage, 20 ability haste, a big chunk of 400 health, and 150 base health regeneration. You know, standard fare. Gives you damage, survivability, a bit of cooldown reduction since fighters are big on ability casting. Its mythic passive is 5 ability haste per legendary item as well. So this item can potentially give you up to 40 ability haste at max build, 45 if you elect to sell your boots for another legendary. 40 ability haste is pretty significant to have on one item. That's roughly 30% cooldown reduction if I remember correctly, and chances are if you're building other fighter items like Black Cleaver, Death's Dance, and the like, you'll have anywhere between 70 to 80 ability haste, which estimates to about 45% CDR. This factor is important for later. It also has an item passive and an active. Passively, it gives you up to 15% bonus AD based on your missing health, with the 15% capped out at 75% missing health. In other words, if you have less than a quarter HP remaining, you'll get 15% bonus AD tacked onto your current AD. This is a very meaningful damage bonus. Most Goredrinker users reach anywhere between 300 to 400 AD in the late game, which can amount to an extra 45 to 60 bonus attack damage. You can expect this item to give you well over 100 AD in the right conditions. The item active is the all too familiar AoE slash, dealing your AD's worth in physical damage and healing you for a quarter of your AD plus 10% of your missing health for each enemy champion hit. It has a 15-second cooldown, but it gets reduced by ability haste, so the real cooldown is around 8 to 10 seconds give or take. Hypothetically, if Thirsting Slash were to strike all 5 members of the enemy team, you will heal for 125% of your attack damage plus 50% missing health. And that explains why Aatrox full heals when he uses the item, even after the nerfs. Objectively speaking, Goredrinker is one of the more appreciated mythic items in League. For as long as I can remember, fighters always had poor itemization. I know everyone was complaining about Season 8 crit items, but for almost half a decade, there was no good first purchase on fighters. Let me explain. Prior to Season 11, almost every physical damage Juggernaut, Diver, and Skirmisher went for one of the 2 Phage items, Black Cleaver and Trinity Force. Triforce gave you a messy hodgepodge of stats and was only really viable on champions that can make use of the attack speed, mana, and Spellblade effect, so it was frequently used on the likes of Irelia, Jax, Fiora, and Darius. The rest had no choice but to go for Black Cleaver, and in all honesty this item was awful. Black Cleaver required a Phage and Kindle Gem, 2 of the worst component items in the game because all Phage did was give you a negligible movement speed boost with auto attacks, and Kindle Gem gave 10% cooldown reduction, which wasn't meaningful either. Your reward for going through the lame components? An item that gave 40 AD, 20% cooldown reduction, and 400 health, 20 bonus movement speed when dealing physical damage, and 24% armor shred. The armor shred sounds pretty decent until you realize that's not gonna actually matter until late game when champions' base armor is high or they start building armor items. Black Cleaver was a terrible first item, but it was the only choice you had for a first item. To make matters worse, the problem with bruiser items is that all of them were scaling or unviable first items. You couldn't build Sterix Gauge because you didn't have enough health to make use of the shield, and back then it was base attack damage, so any champion with bonus AD scaling, which was like everybody, didn't want this item. You couldn't build Ravenous or Titanic Hydra because Ravenous gave no health or cooldown reduction, not to mention Life Steal doesn't benefit fighters since they're casters not auto attackers. Titanic Hydra was only good as a 3rd or 4th item at the very best. Death Stance wasn't good either because fights aren't fast enough in the early game to make use of the bleed. I think you get the point. Itemization was super inefficient for bruisers. There was a time when Black Cleaver was a decent first item back when it required Caulfield's Warhammer instead of Kindle Gem, so it gave you 55 attack damage and 300 health instead of 40 attack damage and 400 health. But when ADC started abusing it, they had to change it back to what it was back then, and that's the only thing fighters had to work with until Goredrinker came about. Yes, Goredrinker is also a scaling item, but it provides enough immediate value to make a difference. It gives almost the same base stats as Black Cleaver, but even with just Goredrinker, you still get like 20 extra attack damage from the 15% bonus. And Thirsting Slash does AoE damage equivalent to an auto attack reset plus essentially a Darius Q heal. Champions that originally rushed Tiamat like Renekton, Fiora, and Kled no longer needed to because Iron Spike Whip gave you that AoE clearing you needed. It does also help that Sterix Gauge was reworked to what it is now, and given its heavy synergy with Goredrinker, it's a very powerful 2-item power spike. You get a good combination of damage and crazy durability, a massive shield plus a heal. A 2000 HP champion with Goredrinker and Sterix is more like a 3500 HP champion, maybe more. Now let's get to the part where I talk about why everyone is using Goredrinker, and there are several different angles I'm approaching this from, so if you get confused easily, I suggest you pay attention. The first segment I want to address is why assassins are building it. Like, why are Kayn, Kha'Zix, Rengar, and Talon building Goredrinker when they should be building lethality items? At the current moment, assassin mythics are redundant and they're very gold inefficient. Aside from Prowler's Claw, none of them provide any situational or tactical benefit to the people who should be building them. All Eclipse does is deal slightly more damage and give you a shield for 2 seconds, which does help with trading, but for assassins it's in their best interest to not get hit at all, and they usually have the tools to dodge attacks, which makes the shield pointless. Dustblade once again causes you to do slightly more damage and apply a really short slow. Now the takedown effect sounds pretty good, 1.5 seconds of invisibility which can give you time to wiggle your way out of danger, except most assassins can do that on their own anyway. Prowler's Claw does have an interesting effect to where it lets you gap close on a target and amplify your damage dealt to them, but once again, assassins already have a lot of mobility so they don't really need that tiny dash in the first place. I'm not saying the earlier champions don't build these items, there are still people who like to rush Prowlers or Dustblade depending on the situation, but the fact that it's not all the time is the problem. As for the gold efficiency, it's also a bit of a yikes. If we're talking base stats, Prowler's is 85.1%, increased by 0.78 for every other legendary item. Eclipse is 72.89% gold efficiency, increased only by 4.69% per additional legendary item. Only about 73% gold efficient, that's horrendous. Duskblade shares the same stats as Prowler's, so it's also 85.1% efficient, increased by 4.17 per legendary. Now, usually when items have low base stat, gold efficiency is typically made up for through their passive or active component. In Prowler's case, I'd say yeah, the dash just about makes up for it, but for Duskblade and especially Eclipse, out of the question. For context, Eclipse's bonus damage is only 6% maximum health, and the shield is 180 base plus 40% bonus AD for 2 seconds. How much damage is Goredrinker's active? 100% of your total AD, so a basic attack essentially, only it hits everyone around you and heals you for 25% AD plus 10% missing health. You get more value from Goredrinker's active slash than Eclipse's passive bonus damage, and their cooldown is more or less the same too. If you are trying to make the case that lethality items do more damage, that in and of itself may not be true. Remember, Goredrinker gives you up to 15% bonus AD based on your missing health. You may not always be at a quarter HP all the time, but unless you're full HP, Goredrinker provides you 70 to 80 attack damage in the mid to late game, much higher than the 55 to 60 that the Assassin Mythics give you. You may not be getting any armor penetration, mind you, but the trade-off is well worth it since you also heal a massive amount and get wave cleared to boot. Also, Prowler's, Duskblade, and Eclipse are all single target applications of damage. Goredrinker is AoE, so the damage potential is much higher with this item than any of the others. Furthermore, assassins generally do enough damage to one-shot any squishy target, so lethality is a bit of an overkill. Goredrinker is too practical of an item. It's good for trades, good for teamfights, good for soaking up damage, and good for clearing too. Every melee champion will be right in the thick of battle, and even if they only hit 2 enemy champions, they'll still be healing a lot. Plus, Goredrinker does a lot of damage. It's an AoE basic attack essentially, and when you have 300 to 400 AD, that damage does matter. It's the same reason skirmishers like Irelia and Tryndamere are building them. It helps them with survivability since they're in the thick of things. I also forgot to mention the active has the same attack windup as your own attack windup, so it scales with attack speed, meaning you don't lose any DPS uptime with Thirsting Slash. Trinity Force is not a good option anymore on the likes of Irelia because she attacks too fast to make use of the Spellblade, and Immortal Shieldbow and Kraken Slayer are bad options on Tryndamere because his biggest problem is his bad wave clear in the early game, which Goredrinker solves. Lastly, and this part is where it becomes a balance issue, Goredrinker doesn't sacrifice any offensive capabilities for the healing privilege. The whole thing about Lifesteal and Omnivamp is that you have to lose out on something in return. For AD carries, Bloodthirster and Immortal Shieldbow are items that provide you with much better survivability both in neutral and in teamfights, but the drawback is you take a massive damage cut to gain access to that lifesteal. You'll be doing nowhere near the same amount of DPS as someone with Kraken Slayer and Infinity Edge. I mean, depending on the situation, you might do more because the longer you survive for, the more damage you can theoretically do. But the point remains the same, your DPS, the rate at which you can do damage in a set time frame, will be noticeably lower. Goredrinker doesn't have this problem. Does it do as much damage as Divine Sunderer? No, because that item is busted. But it's no damage reduction, that's for sure. Remember that 15% passive bonus AD and the ability haste. Lower cooldowns means more attacks. Goredrinker offers incredible damage and durability, best of both worlds. If that's the case, wouldn't the simplest solution be to either nerf or remove the bonus AD you get from being low health? That's not it either. This is why the title of the video says the most problematic item in League of Legends. If you remove that passive, the ones who will be hurt by it most are not assassins nor skirmishers, it will be the fighters. It's the only element keeping fighters relevant in the late game. A lot of people like to think Juggernauts and Divers have incredible late games because they do too much damage and are too tanky. And to their credit, when you take a look at Xinjiao or Set, I can understand why you would think that way. But right now, Goredrinker is the only thing holding up a lot of champions. Those champions for whom Goredrinker was intended for are in a very tenuous position, held up by one item and one item only. The problem is, people have grown wise to the power of this mythic item and are exploiting it on any champion that can afford the downsides. Stuff like this has happened before, and it's the driving force behind a lot of items giving reduced benefits for ranged champions due to their ability to meet the activation requirements more safely and consistently. Sometimes the overpopularity of an item leads to it getting nerfed as a way to prevent exploitation, but in exchange, it cripples the champions who are using it as a crutch or necessity rather than for min-maxing. Goredrinker is the most egregious case of this to date. No other item has held this many champions afloat, and if Riot nerfs the item in an attempt to stop assassins and skirmishers from exploiting it, that will deteriorate an entire class of champions, maybe more, which will cause far more issues down the road, not exactly the best choice logistically. All the same, it's a problem, one that should be addressed because it's beginning to frustrate a lot of people. I just don't know what that solution is. So I'm gonna end off the video here, I think, it's getting kinda long. Maybe I'm blowing things out of proportion and it's not as big of a problem as I'm making it out to be, but I'm starting to notice a lot of players are making memes about how everyone uses Goredrinker, so I wanted to offer my thoughts on it. Anyway, if you enjoyed the video, a rating would be much appreciated. Consider subbing to the channel for more content like this. Don't forget to follow me on my socials and join my Discord server, and if you haven't yet, I suggest you check out my previous discussion videos after this one. But for now, thanks so much for watching, and I'll see you again soon for the next one. Take care.